You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Dr. R.J. Graham. Dr. R.J. Graham is a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of the Geophysical Sciences at the University of Chicago, specializing in the study of planetary and Earth systems. His research focuses on the dynamics of atmospheres, oceans, ice, and climate, as well as the evolution of planetary interiors and surfaces. He combines expertise in planetary sciences and cosmochemistry to address critical questions about the processes shaping planetary environments over time.
R.J. Graham, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Excited to be back.
R.J., we have a very serious problem in the star system, and it is the increasing luminosity of the sun. And as this plays out over the next, roughly 600 million to 1 billion years, this planet is going to become uninhabitable far earlier than the 4.5 billion years left we have with the sun before its red giant phase, and it presumably swallows up the Earth. Now, what is the mechanism here that is going to shut down plant life as the luminosity of the sun increases? What happens that's going to start killing things?
Well, there are kind of two different things happening within this model that kill plant life. As the sun is brightening, the planet, assuming that you kept the atmosphere's composition the same, if you just brightened the sun, the planet would get hotter, right? And heat is one of the things that could kill off the plants. If things get too hot, then eventually you reach a point where photosynthesis doesn't work anymore. It's just too warm. So one of the possible ways that the brightening of the sun in the future could kill the plants is overheating. Another way is through what I'll call CO2 starvation, because photosynthesis, you think of plants kind of as like, building their bodies out of the ground, right? But they're not. They get some water and nutrients out of the ground, but the material from which they constitute their bodies comes from the air, CO2. They're pulling in CO2 and building themselves from that through photosynthesis. And you need CO2 in the air to drive that process forward, to have photosynthesis happen. And if CO2 gets too low, there's eventually a certain point where plants, as they exist right now, can't do that anymore and they die off. In the future, as the sun is brightening, the CO2 in the atmosphere is expected to go down because of this thermostat kind of built into Earth's biogeochemical cycles. It's called the carbonate silicate cycle. You've always got CO2 entering the atmosphere through volcanic outgassing from Earth's interior. If you didn't have something to pull that out, then Earth would just accumulate CO2 and become Venus. We'd get super duper hot. But there's a process called silicate weathering that removes the CO2 from the atmosphere and pulls it out and reacts with silicate rocks to make something called carbonate rocks that end up on the seafloor. And that process happens faster when it's hot and it slows down when it's cold. So as the sun brightens and Earth's surface warms, that silicate weathering process can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, which on the one hand helps keep Earth from overheating as quickly as it would. But on the other hand, is eventually, once the CO2 reaches a certain very low threshold, photosynthesis can go forward. So CO2 starvation is one of the ways, and overheating is another of the ways that you could kill off plants. And most papers that have looked at this question of how long into the future land plants could exist on Earth, when they've run these calculations, they typically come to the conclusion that plants will die off by the CO2 starvation mechanism in about 1 billion years. But what I argue, and what my co-authors, Dorian Abbott and Itai Halevi, what we argue in this paper is that when you do a better job of modeling Earth's carbon cycle, and when you do a better job of modeling the way plant photosynthesis will react in the future to the different surface temperatures and CO2s, that actually things will last significantly longer, and plausibly the plants will die by overheating instead of by the CO2 starvation mechanism. And they might die about 800 million years later than has been typically suggested. So approximately doubling that future lifespan compared to previous estimates.
Is there a path for further evolution of plants? As these conditions change, they're going to do it gradually. Can adaptation occur, and can plants say we're gone, right? And we can't do anything about it, but the plants are still here. Do they have room for evolution in order to become better at maintaining themselves in a warmer environment?
I think that's an important question. And I think actually like one of the interesting things about this paper is that sort of we push the future lifespan forward far enough that even like let's say okay, so I agree, yes, very likely that in the next 1.8 billion years plants will experience a great deal of evolution. The plants have only existed currently, plants like land plants on the surface have only existed for maybe 500 million years or something like that, and vascular land plants even a little bit less than that. And in fact, they're still evolving. So within the past 30 million years, a couple different entirely like new forms of photosynthesis, new metabolisms have evolved. Not new forms, but basically like they're ways to concentrate CO2 to do photosynthesis more efficiently at low CO2 levels. Because in the millions of years ago, the CO2 on Earth was higher because as we noted, the sun is brightening, right? And so as the sun brightens in the future, the CO2 is going to go lower. Well, you project that backwards. The sun was dimmer in the past and there was more CO2 in the atmosphere. So it was easier for photosynthesis to happen. In the last, few tens of millions of years, the CO2 has gotten quite low compared to historical averages, and plants have developed ways to deal with that and to continue photosynthesizing pretty efficiently despite that. And we represent that in this paper. That's one of the interesting things in the paper that people hadn't bothered doing yet with these calculations, was separating out a couple of these different forms of photosynthesis to allow to account for that. But anyway, in the so at that 1.8 billion years or whatever that potentially plants could last out to in this model, if plants are existing that far in the future, by that time, Earth's surface is getting really hot. Like the maximum temperature in this model that we allow plant photosynthesis to happen is 338 Kelvin, which is like 65 Celsius, which is, I off the top of my head, I forget what it is in Fahrenheit, but it's really hot. It's over 100 Fahrenheit. And that's the hottest that plants have been seen to be able to photosynthesize when heated to that temperature consistently. There's a very strange grass that when it has a specific fungus that's infected with a specific virus, it can deal with temperatures that high. So that's like the max temperature for plants that we allow for in this model. Okay, so if plants exist up to that point in the far future, by the time Earth is that hot, it's right on the verge, or possibly even will have entered either a moist greenhouse state or a runaway greenhouse state. A moist greenhouse state is basically where the surface is hot enough that the what's called the cold trap at the tropopause, which is basically like a minimum in temperature up high in the atmosphere that kind of dries out the air very high up in the atmosphere in the stratosphere. Once the surface of the Earth is hot enough, that cold trap stops being efficient. So Earth's stratosphere, this upper layer in the atmosphere, gets very wet, and that can drive pretty rapid, geologically rapid water loss. So that's one of the ways in which, like, if plants last up to this point where Earth is entering like these either the moist greenhouse or the runaway greenhouse, which is even worse. The runaway greenhouse is where all of your oceans evaporate. If plants last up to that point, then it doesn't really matter if they can evolve to exist at somewhat higher temperatures than that, because they're already at the point where Earth is going to start like either evaporating its oceans or losing its water to space. And so I do think it's possible that evolution will occur that would allow for plants to continue photosynthesizing at higher temperatures, maybe conceivably. But the like actual planetary climate conditions, once we're in that hot far future area, are right on the edge of like total uninhabitability. So I think that's one of the like kind of interesting conclusions of the paper actually, is that potentially complex life, when you define quote unquote complex life as vascular land plants, because in this, on Earth, they're the cornerstone of large multicellular biological functioning. They, if they weren't there, then on Earth's surface, not much would be going on. So if you define the future lifespan of complex life as being contemporaneous with the future lifespan of land plants, then the paper suggests that complex life can last right up to the point where Earth will just be uninhabitable, potentially even for simple life, right? So like it kind of gives less wiggle room for future evolutionary adaptation to lengthen the lifespan. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but wanted to hit the points.
We love really long answers here. That's what we're here for. Now, that weird infected grass was one of the things that really piqued my interest in that paper, because that list is starting to look a lot like a symbiosis. And the plant kingdom, you see symbiosis happening. I know that beans are in a symbiotic relationship with, soil organism. So it's interesting that that's actually that's not really evolution so much as it is the development of symbiosis. And that too has affected the path life has taken on Earth before. And I think it'd be fascinating if it reincorporates something like a virus or something like that, that gives it an advantage above and beyond what evolution can do. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, yeah, the plant fungus symbiosis is like fundamental to the functioning of plants and to like pretty much as far as I understand it, like every land plant that grows on Earth has some sort of symbiotic relationship with fungi in the soil. It's like a sort of I'm pretty sure people have even argued it may have been like a necessity in order to make transition to land, although don't, I'm not 100% sure that that's like a widely accepted suggestion. But like the idea that fungal symbiosis with plants might be necessary for whatever, like for their future existence, is totally plausible because it is already fundamental to their existence right now. Yeah. And one of the really interesting things about that tripartite symbiosis between plant, fungus, and virus is like, if you don't have the virus and then you put that fungus on the plant, then it doesn't give them any kind of extra thermal tolerance. Like you need that full chain of plant infected with fungus, infected with virus. And another interesting thing about that is that same fungus, these scientists, these people that were, doing this analysis of the temperature power that the thermotolerance that it imparts, they took the fungus infected with the virus and they put it, for example, on tomatoes to see if that gave the tomatoes thermal tolerance. And it did. And they did the same thing with like watermelons, I think, and it did. Like, so it seems like a not necessarily a thing that is specific to the grass, and so it could be a sort of thing that if we reach the point where the Earth is like so hot that you would need some kind of extra thermotolerance to be growing, then those are the sorts of like plants that would just be adaptationally favored. As it is right now, they mostly like you don't really need that level of thermotolerance pretty much anywhere on Earth, largely other than where they exist, which is right in really hot, like geothermal areas. Like they're right beside, a hot spring or something where the soil's incredibly hot. And so then when you get like close to these really hot things, you start finding, oh, okay, it's only these like bizarre plants with these crazy adaptations. But I think that they could, in the far future, play a fundamental role, just like fungi and plant roots have continued to do so for their entire existence.
And it's actually, in a way, it's kind of like a full circle ending because it was believed anyway to be the fungi that actually broke up the soil in the first place. Giant, almost mushrooms, these gigantic organisms
Right.
that used to catch fire a lot, apparently, based on the fossils. And they were the ones that made land plants possible because they broke the soil up. And it's almost like Earth will come full circle and the fungi come back, and make a comeback and hold plant life once again on land on this planet after many billions of years. I find that kind of interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful. It's part of the reason I like to work on this sort of biogeochemical thing, is just thinking about all of these sort of unintuitive couplings between realms that aren't obviously related from a distance, but when you zoom in, they turn out to like, why would, it's strange that, for example, like the rate at which certain kinds of rocks react with CO2 under different temperatures could influence give you an extra billion years of plant life on your planet. And I think that's kind of thematically similar to what you're saying. It's bizarre that these deep connections matter so much potentially for like thinking about fundamental things. I agree with you. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer, but your point is well taken.
There's another example too that just comes to mind. There are these sinkholes, subsurface sinkholes that occur in the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan being one of them, not too far from you actually, and Lake Huron also has them. And what they do is they're just subterranean sinkholes. Groundwater undermines it, the cavern forms, and the lake collapses it, and there's a sinkhole. But those sinkholes serve as very low oxygen ecosystems, environments.
Mm.
And what happens is you get this dance of cyanobacteria and a completely separately different type of bacteria that are constantly locked in this battle where part of the day the cyanobacteria are doing well And then towards the other part of the day, the other bacteria are doing well, and they just go back and forth each day in a sort of dominance in this ecosystem. So these two completely unrelated microorganisms, well, not completely unrelated, but distantly related microorganisms, might not even be able to exist without each other.
Yep.
And you just have this sort of, but that's why this is so difficult, is because Earth's ecosystems and its atmosphere are unbelievably complex with all sorts of, I mean, every model, as far as I can tell, is basically a simplification, right?
Absolutely.
But would that be a good way to characterize it?
Oh, totally. Yeah. No, yeah, that's the game of figuring out how to do modeling usefully is kind of deciding what to simplify in a principled way, like what to get a reasonable answer for whatever question you're asking. Like you certainly are not going to be able to include all of the relevant stuff. How much can you exclude without making your model worthless? So yeah, I mean that's like have to wrestle with that in a very practical way to do this sort of to approach these sorts of questions. I mean, yeah, for example, like so I talked about how there's a couple different forms of photosynthesis that have evolved in the last 30 million years to deal with like the low CO2 environment that we exist in now. And I know it sounds weird to say low CO2 when people talk about how we're emitting CO2 and increasing it rapidly, which is true. But yeah, like throughout most of Earth's history, the CO2 is very high, much higher than it is now because the sun was dimmer. So in this model, in this paper, we account for the default mode of the land plants, which is called the C3 photosynthesis, or like kind of the original metabolism. And then there's another one, C4 photosynthesis, which is another one that we account for in this model. But there's another form, a much less like currently much less important in terms of like global amounts of plant productivity, but another form of photosynthesis that emerged around the same time as C4 in partially maybe in response to the low CO2 as well, but also possibly in response to low water conditions. It's called CAM photosynthesis. This is what, for example, cacti, lots of different sorts of succulents that they use this kind of photosynthesis, and it basically allows plants to they can preserve their water because they only open up the pores that let out the water at night, and that allows them to not get dried out during the daytime, basically. And it's a whole nother form of like a whole nother way to do photosynthesis, just like the other plants do, but slightly differently. Didn't include that in this model, but I could very well see that becoming extremely important in the far future because it allows you to deal with these more arid conditions. For example, we were talking about, oh, well, could you evolve plants to last longer than what we have in this model? Well, and I said, well, maybe not. Maybe it wouldn't matter that much because once they get to this point, it's so hot that the earth is starting to dry out. Well, but if you include these CAM plants, if you include these plants that are adapted to aridity, then that could extend your future lifespan for plants significantly, right? Maybe as the earth is drying out, you still have these like clusters of very arid condition adapted plants that are existing around whatever last bodies of water exist on earth, things like that, that could squeeze another 500 million years or something out of that potentially. It's hard to say, but yeah, that's a big simplification that we made in the model because as of right now, CAM photosynthesis is maybe 5%, I think, of the global productivity, whereas C3 is like something like 75 and C4 is something like 20. Those are just estimates. So right now it's a minor thing, but in the future it could be very important, and maybe that changes our results fundamentally. It's hard to say. That's the sort of the exact kind of thing you have to try and just make cost benefit analysis for what to include or exclude when you're doing the kind of simulations about these wacky complex systems.
It is far future Earth it's the descendants of the cactus.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
That's infected with a fungus.
yeah, right. Yeah, that's what we need to do. We need to give cacti that fungus, see what happens with them, because the cacti already have very powerful thermotolerance. Some of them in their interiors can get like even hotter. It's just like the actual air temperature doesn't get to the level that to that 338 Kelvin, 65 Celsius limit. Typically, cacti don't experience that from the air, but they're big and fat, right? And so inside of them, they can get really hot, and like they have figured out how to adapt to deal with that. So yeah, it'd be very interesting to give the supercharging fungus virus symbiosis to a cactus. I doubt anybody's tried that.
Yeah, that would be interesting, and just the succulents may be ahead of their time because,
Yeah, right.
and again that ability to conserve water like that is so obvious. Anybody that's ever owned a cactus or interacted with one knows
Totally.
that thing is really holding water really well.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And it amazes me that something like that can live in a desert like that and hold that. But they do. And it's just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, amazing.
Now, um, the next question is okay, let's look at an Earth where humans are still there and we're trying to save the planet and buy time. And we decide, okay, we're pretty good at releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, at least we are right now. Could we artificially extend this to that 1.8 billion year limit?
Yeah, I mean, totally. I think that that is a thing that is so my PhD supervisor would kind of like jokingly talk about that, like because before I did this paper, the like standard picture was that you get to the CO2 starvation limit in about 1 billion years, and he would say, well, we can just start cooking limestone and releasing CO2 to sustain the plants as long as we need to, or at least until we reach the runaway greenhouse limit. So yeah, totally. I think that is a thing that could be done if need be. Although, yeah, maybe another approach to it, you could, since we're talking about, 1 billion years in the future, you could also have space mirrors, things like that. You could have things to reflect away the sunlight and then kind of just hold Earth's insolation at whatever level you wanted, and then allow the CO2 maybe to land wherever it wants to. But, by that far in the future, we are going to have if we exist, we'd have pretty serious control over a lot of those biogeochemical cycles potentially. But yeah, totally. I think so. Yeah. If it looked like Earth was headed toward a CO2 starvation and you had intelligent beings, I think they could steer away from that pretty easily. Yeah, just by like allowing a tenth of their emissions not to get recaptured by whatever mechanism.
Now, the increasing luminosity of the sun, how does that affect the other terrestrial planets? Obviously not Mercury, it'll just bake it even more, but how does Venus change, or does it change? And how does Mars change? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, so with Venus is already sort of in that, it's so there's what people define the circumstellar habitable zone, like with an inner edge that is so the circumstellar habitable zone being just like the range of orbits around a star where you could ostensibly plop an Earth-like planet and then have its carbonate silicate cycle adjust its CO2 to somewhere that would allow liquid water to flow on its surface, right? So that's what like is broadly meant when people talk about the habitable zone. And Venus is already currently way within, like it's getting too much sunlight. So it's deep within the habitable zone. It's possible that in the deep past, like it depends on the exact evolutionary path Venus took. Some people have suggested that in like way back a few billion years ago, if it was spinning slow enough and its clouds were thick enough, it may have been able to reflect away enough sunlight for some period to sustain oceans and have like an Earth-like surface. And then sometime in the past few billion years, the sun became bright enough that it overcame even that and then drove it into this runaway greenhouse state where the oceans evaporate, and then eventually you lose your water completely into space through photolysis, and leaving, like, you break apart the water molecules, hydrogen escapes to space, oxygen reacts with crust, and so you end up with a dried out planet. Some people think that's what happened to Venus already. Anyway, in the future, there's no real good, like, Venus won't get more habitable. Mars will get more habitable, quote unquote. I mean, in the sense that like it will be in a more favorable place within the habitable zone, because that habitable zone is expanding, like moving outward, right? Because of that brightening effect that we've talked about. You have the actual like distance from the star where you have an inner edge and an outer edge is pushing out as the sun brightens. And Mars, very early in its history, was outside of the putative habitable zone. Like it was on the past of the outer edge, at least depending on how you define it. Like there are kind of conservative and optimistic definitions of it. But as the sun has brightened, it has entered the like putative habitable zone, and it will be, deeper and deeper into the habitable zone as the sun continues brightening. But the problem with Mars right now is that it is, geologically dead, meaning there's not this CO2 outgassing going on from its interior that would allow for example, to allow the carbonate silicate cycle to go, the thing that stabilizes Earth's climate and that allows Earth to keep a temperate surface even though the sun is brightening. Without an outgassing rate from your interior of CO2, you can't have that going. And so, like, if Mars is geologically dead, it won't become ungeologically dead as the sun brightens. But that doesn't mean, we wouldn't be able to go there and mess around with it potentially, which hopefully we do.
Yes, and in fact, we may be living on Mars by this time in the far future, having abandoned Earth and just said, well, we're done with that one. We'll move on to this one.
Just get another few 100 million years, yeah.
Yeah, you get another few 100 million years. Then when eventually you're out at the melting ice shell moons at Jupiter or something, or going to another star system entirely, because over this time scale, the sun is going to have close encounters with other star systems numerous times, and we can't even predict which ones. They're just too far in the future. And if one of them has a suitable planet and it passes within a light year, well, there we go. Might be easier.
Right, yeah.
So there are a lot of things to think about. But in regards to the solar system, the one thing that really gives me the chills is the fact that Venus may have been a surface water world, as you explained. Mars was early in its history; it was an ocean world, and Earth was. That's three terrestrial ocean worlds in a single star system. What does that say for the exoplanets, for liquid water and habitable zones? It's just staggering to me. There must be ocean worlds everywhere out there. What's your view?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I agree. I mean, there's even, one of the like sort of suggestions that I've found, I don't know, stimulating regarding that kind of like this question of, yeah, it's interesting that, yeah, maybe Mars, Venus, and Earth kind of had like a similar sort of thing going on. There's some correlation within our system, and some people have suggested that might, like, it may be that our solar system is actually unusually dry, and that lots and lots of solar systems will have like huge amounts of water, such that their planets have so much water that they're like uninhabitable, because they're like, if you have too much water, you get to a point where you have these high pressure ice layers down at the bottom of your oceans that kind of turn off any geochemical cycles and seem to probably preclude a lot of interesting chemistry and things that happen when you have less water. And it's been suggested that maybe some systems, if you have a star system forming near a place where either a supernova or like a collision between neutron stars happen, those things can produce huge amounts of radioactive elements that can decay, and they release a lot of heat. And so if you're forming a star system in the aftermath of one of these events that would have released a bunch of, especially an isotope aluminum-26, which decays fast and heats things, and then you're forming your planets out of like these guts that have a lot of this radioactive aluminum-26 in it. Even if you started off with a huge amount of water, like 50% of your planet is water, if you have enough of these radioactive elements, the heating of them can actually like desiccate the planets and get most of the water not stuck to the planet. So it's been suggested that maybe actually like that happened here in this solar system. So we got kind of lucky and lost a lot of water from Earth, Mars, Venus, and had, we're just kind of left behind with a little residue that was enough to make our big oceans and things like that. But that lots of other star systems might have too much water. But that's a thing that's like slowly being kind of actually going to be testable, and is starting to be testable with James Webb, like to actually say whether that is a feasible explanation for the distribution of masses and radiuses of radii of planets. But yeah, essentially, yeah, it seems like there may be these interesting kind of like system-wide correlations. And I mean, you could ask like similarly with TRAPPIST, like whether they're all very wet, or possibly they all had their water blown off early. That's another thing that's being kind of like actually looked at now with some detail. Yeah, it's exciting. Within the next few decades, actual answers to some of these questions are gonna like emerge.
What really makes me wonder about water is the effect that water plays in plate tectonics, and what effects plate tectonics have on life.
Yes.
And it may be that water is way more important for planetary evolution than mere biology. It may be crucial to life in a geologic sense, not biologic, but geologic sense as well. And I've always wondered about that.
Yeah. People argue, that with water on your surface, that kind of changes like the properties of the crust, and it, for example, might allow plates to slide past each other more easily. It also might change sort of the bendiness of the plates, like their ability to bend without breaking, things like that. That's one of these things that is like super debated. It's hilarious how poorly understood plate tectonics is, despite how like deeply important it is for thinking about these things because there are people try and model like, okay, what are the conditions under which plate tectonics happens? And there, like a decade ago, for example, like kind of early when people were starting to do lots of exoplanet modeling, there was like a series of papers that were like, okay, with our mathematical model of what the conditions are for plate tectonics, it looks like every single super Earth will certainly have plate tectonics. So that's what one paper says. And then another paper comes out like the same year that says, okay, with our mathematical model for the conditions for plate tectonics, it appears that super Earths will never ever have plate tectonics. And then another paper comes out the same year. With our mathematical model, it appears that actually it doesn't really matter if your planet is too big or too big or like bigger or more little. It actually matters if it has water. It's a very like it's still like it's hard to say. And then without knowing that, like these questions of habitability are really hard to answer. Like, yeah, I don't know. This kind of illustrates that whole point about like trying to decide what things are crucial for modeling and things like that. But yeah, I do think that one of the most popular pictures for it is that water is fundamental to either its initiation or to its maintenance. And that's plausible. I mean, it makes sense. But it's also like, yeah, it's an open question still. And hopefully, like, for example, once we actually start to be able to look at exoplanets close enough to say, oh, okay, there's a little bit of land there, maybe, like things like that. Hopefully, we'll actually be able to start making statistical statements about these things and testing these models explicitly because it's fundamental. It underpins thinking about any of these cycles. Without plate tectonics, for example, the carbonate silicate cycle that I've talked about, that's kind of part of this whole sustaining habitability also might not function. It's unclear. Like there are some models that attempt to examine whether you could have a similar cycle in a quote unquote stagnant lid world, which is like a world without plate tectonics, basically, where instead of having your crust fractured, you have one big plate on top. And then without the plate tectonics, a lot like you don't have things getting transported into the interior of the planet as efficiently. And that's one of the fundamental parts of the ability of the planet to regulate its CO2 is that once you've taken the CO2 out of the air and put it into rocks, you need to put it back deep into the planet again to heat it back up to re-release the CO2 because it's a cycle. And potentially with stagnant lid worlds, that might not happen efficiently enough to sustain enough outgassing to like keep your planet habitable. So yeah, understanding the conditions that allow for plate tectonics is very important for asking these questions about how common aliens might be, for example. And we're kind of just getting to the cusp of maybe being able to really meaningfully look at that, hopefully this century.
It really is. It's one of those huge missing puzzle pieces that
Exactly.
could be a great filter for all we know.
And
And
it's,
that
we didn't even know. Like, I cannot get over the fact that plate tectonics as a concept, like my dad wasn't like he did elementary school before plate tectonics was a thing, like before people knew before that was suggested. Like obviously there was still like people talked about like continental drift, but like this mechanism, the actual mechanism of plate tectonics it's so new. Like I don't know, it's insane to me. Yeah, I agree with you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
even since when I was in high school, we knew about it, but that's only been 30 years. But we didn't know anywhere near what we know now, and what we really know now is that we don't know that much.
Right.
And it's fascinating because Venus doesn't have this. Neither does Mars. Maybe they did at one time in the distant past, but it's done. And we don't even know what Venus is doing. There's still ideas that that thing occasionally cracks open
Yeah, right.
and has a planet-wide
Hmm.
volcanic event.
Hmm.
Venus is a weird one.
Fascinating.
Well, what'll be interesting is with the web observations and things like that. It could even happen with TRAPPIST-1. I know that they've characterized two of the planets. I'm waiting for the next one. That's going to be the really interesting one.
Hmm.
But if it comes out an analog of Venus, that's going to be interesting because I'm equally interested, honestly, is how unique is Earth, but how unique is Venus? Just because Venus is the odd man out or odd woman out actually of this solar system, and it just fascinates me that those conditions happen like that, and how common is that in the universe? And we don't know yet. We're only just capable of starting to look at terrestrial exoplanets. One last question.
Totally.
So the one thing that we haven't covered yet, we've covered evolution trying to get around the increasing luminosity of the sun. But what of, again, human technology and genetic engineering? Is there a way to genetically engineer plants to be photosynthetic at higher temperatures? Can that be envisioned?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. And I'm not enough of a biological, I don't know jack about genetic engineering, basically to put it more shortly. But I I think So I think maybe that would be difficult without actually like fundamentally kind of changing the biochemistry itself. Because I do think a big reason that there is this, the reason that as you get hotter, a lot of processes break down kind of like fundamentally has to do with like the proteins and chemicals and materials that are being utilized by biology. Like they're kind of like down to the chemistry. And so my vague non-biologist sense is that to get to really high temperatures, you might have to actually like, I don't know what you would need to do. You need to swap out the biochemistry potentially. But that's me talking from a place of substantial ignorance.
Well, we better get to work. We only have at most 1.8 billion years before the cucumbers go extinct, and we start losing the oxygen, which
Exactly.
that's a completely different question. Is that when the plants die, especially the cyanobacteria and everything in the oceans, the oxygen is gone in a few tens of millions of years, or fundamentally gone. And that's all life. And all that could be left after that would be maybe the anaerobes, and eventually they die when the planet goes molten again because of the heating up sun. So no matter any way you cut it, this planet will become uninhabitable in the future. But we got time.
Well, unless we do the thing they did in Ringworld, I think, is it Ringworld, where they've got those aliens that they take their planet and they just fly it around like a spaceship. We could do that.
Yes, there is the idea of migrating Earth, but I don't like this idea because RJ, to do it, you would have to do multiple millions of close passes of Earth with asteroids to nudge it out, along with the habitable zone moving out. And if you've got multiple millions of asteroid strikes, one of them's going to hit you. You're going to mess up. And then we go out the way of the dinosaurs.
Fair point. Fair point.
Of course, that might be more fun than dying at the hands of the sun, actually, though.
Potentially, yeah, a little bit less.
Enjoy the vista,
Yeah, right. And it's a rather than having to, the long slow decline versus the big the finale.
Yes, of course, the finale probably would cause you to almost instantly go blind, I would think. So you probably won't see very much. But in any case, RJ, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to your next paper. And the new paper will be linked in the description below.
Awesome.
Yeah, hopefully come back and see us again as your work continues, especially in this field.
Beautiful. I would love to. Yeah, it's always a pleasure. I'm working now. Some extensions on this, also some stuff regarding the initiation of the snowball Earth events a few 100 million years ago, because that is pretty fundamental to thinking about planetary habitability as well. Trying to understand, hey, what exactly might cause planets to randomly freeze to the equator? And so doing some simulations about that, and once that stuff's out, happy to talk about that too. But yeah, especially the future lifespan stuff, because I do expect to continue thinking about that.
Well, I can tell you this: that interview, the coming interview, when you get that work done, my fundamental overarching question about snowball Earth will be the faint young sun.
Perfect. Excellent. Yeah, that couples right into the carbonate silicate cycle and thinking about all that stuff. It's all like one question in a sense.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.